It is really fascinating to watch this coronavirus response on a global level. This is supposed to be the great era of globalization. We have these summits that we all follow so closely every year, ASEAN, APEC, G20, G7, and it seems like we've so quickly just reverted back to our own nations.
That's right, Annalise, and we've talked a lot over the last year about different countries moving toward or away from different multilateral institutions. So let's look at this week. The G7 foreign ministers meeting occurred, and then as you recently reported there, the G20 held a heads of state video conference. So I think over a dozen of the G20 heads of state were on that. But unlike a normal G20 conference, which would be 2 days and have a lot of in-person side meetings where most of the actual work gets done, this was a 90-minute video teleconference that basically allowed each leader to go around and say that they agree that we need to work together on this. But unfortunately, that doesn't actually change the dynamics that are behind the scenes. You've already seen that President Trump is sort of going back and forth between saying, I'm going to try to work with President Xi, but also sending signals that they're blaming China for misinformation and maybe even some delay in informing the world about this. So there's a lot of amidst these multilateral fora, finger pointing going on. So we have to remind ourselves that amidst all of this, the undercurrent of national interests of each country is not going to change, but how they react and how they try to protect their countries from coronavirus will, of course, continue to be front page news.
And there is some frustration with China on the global stage that there was that delay in reporting of COVID-19 when it originally came out because they were trying to manage it internally. And there's been some consternation around the naming of it as well, calling it COVID-19. Some want it called the Wuhan virus. That is historically a precedent to call a virus by the name of where it started, but it seems too politically charged at the moment to be doing that.
Right, and the G7 actually ended up not being able to put together a cohesive statement after the foreign minister conference this week because the U.S. insisted in its draft, with the U.S. being the chair of the G7 currently, it would actually create the draft of that document, put in Wuhan virus, and most of the other countries would not sign on to that. So they actually ended up having parallel statements, which is not entirely uncommon. But in this case, where, like I said, we're trying to show that countries have at least a unified agreement. The G20 just completed their video teleconference not too long ago, and they did release a statement that you can see in its entirety online. And it basically is a huge testament to multilateralism and trying to support the multilateral intergovernmental organizations that are trying to help the world here. It also specifically talks about trying to put a lot of money, I think over 4 trillion USD is what they said, together into the economy. So that's the plan from the G20 perspective.
And just amazingly, in the midst of all this on a global scale, we have seen an increase in violence in Afghanistan.
That's right. Back to my earlier point. Unfortunately, the dynamics of competition and conflict, all of these are unchanged. There will be some governmental focus on, of course, addressing the coronavirus. But in Afghanistan, we're seeing increased violence. You saw a Sikh temple attacked yesterday, reportedly by ISIS. Secretary Pompeo, the Secretary of State from the U.S., actually in this week where almost everything is done by video conference, flew to Afghanistan to hold 9 hours of meetings between the two dueling presidents, if you will, Ghani and Abdullah, that have both claimed that they are the rightful president of Afghanistan, and actually said that he's going to suggest that the U.S. pull $1 billion of aid from Afghanistan next year unless Afghanistan can remove this political impasse. So these are all things that would be normal headlines if coronavirus wasn't on the front page right now, but they're going to continue. And you may have even seen Afghanistan just agreed to release 10,000 prisoners from normal prisons above the age of 55. And we've also talked about how Afghanistan and the Taliban are in the middle of a prisoner exchange. So, of course, in these tightly packed prison environments, all of this is very important to how the virus spreads. So the two cannot be disconnected.
Absolutely. And just finally, in the midst of all this, when we're speaking of things that would normally be headline news, there has been some progress with the charges against people accused of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
That's right. So it's just about a year and a half since Jamal Khashoggi was murdered in Turkey. And you might remember that last December, the Saudi government completed their investigation, which was sort of criticized around the world by human rights groups as being completely opaque. Well, this was Turkey's investigation this week. Remember, it occurred on Turkish territory, and 20 Saudi citizens were indicted, including 2 that were very close to the crown prince, the former intelligence advisor and the former royal advisor. But at the same day, here we have Saudi is actually chairing the G20 meeting. They're the current chair of the G20 meeting. So when people talk about, customary international law, and even if most of the people in the world think that the crown prince of Saudi Arabia was actually behind this murder and that these 20 people premeditated it, the question is will Khashoggi really ever fully see justice if the current Saudi leadership remains in power? It's really important for us to check in on this, not just for the future of free press, but also for Jamal Khashoggi's memory himself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jason Israel.